Curse of the Black Rock. Under the cover of eternal night, when the camp lights fade and darkness covers the area, stands Black Rock. It stands like a tombstone in a world where the living and the dead are intertwined, deprived of rest. The mountains that surround it seem to stand guard, hiding ancient secrets that even time fears to touch. This fortress, once the heart of the mighty orcs, is now their most terrible prison. The locals said that the Black Rock was breathing, and anyone who came close to it could hear its muffled groans. There was no grass growing around it, no birds singing, and even wild animals avoided the place. Only the wind, carrying the smell of rotting flesh and the cold of death, reminded that this fortress had once been part of the living world. No one knew what had happened that fateful day when the orcs laid siege to Black Rock, but everyone remembered how the place had gone dark after that. Scouts sent into the fortress never returned, and those who narrowly escaped were found mad, muttering of monsters and shadows that preyed on souls. One day, by order of the Horde's leader, a detachment of the best warriors was assembled to penetrate Black Rock and find out what evil had awakened there. They were veterans of many battles, tempered in the fire of battle. Their hearts knew fear, but it did not control them. At the head of the detachment stood Gromash Timbercutter, a majestic orc with eyes full of hatred for his enemies and devotion to his people. He was old, his body bore many scars, but the strength of his spirit was unwavering. The warriors set out, leaving behind warm hearths and loving families. With every step, the darkness deepened, as if the land itself was warning them of the coming danger. When they reached the Black Rock, a strange feeling came over them. The air became heavy, as if an invisible cloud hung above them. The wind that had once whispered in their ears suddenly died down, and the world around them became still. The fortress greeted them with a dead silence. Not a single sound, not a single movement. Only the ominous shadows dancing on the walls created the illusion of life. The warriors froze in front of the huge gates, which seemed to look at them with silent reproach. Gromash felt his heart stop, but quickly cast aside his doubts and ordered them to move forward. It was dark and damp inside the Black Rock. The walls, covered in mold and ancient writing, seemed alive. The warriors moved slowly, following Gromash, their breathing heavy, their eyes wary of the enemy in every corner. Strange sounds echoed around them, as if someone was watching them from the darkness. The first to feel the cold gaze was one of the younger warriors. He stopped, looking around, and immediately his face was distorted with horror. It seemed to him that thousands of eyes, sparkling with green fire, were looking at him from behind the wall. His comrades noticed this, but did not have time to do anything. Suddenly, a scream rang out in the darkness, and the warriors saw how the body of their comrade began to shake convulsively. Black foam gushed from his mouth, his eyes rolled back, and he fell to the ground, dead. This was the first sign of what awaited them in the depths of the fortress. Gromash, suppressing his fear, ordered them to move on. The warriors continued on their way, but every step they took echoed as if thousands of feet were stamping towards them. Suddenly, a massive door appeared before them, covered in ancient runes. It was like a gate to another world where eternal darkness reigned. The warriors froze, but Gromash, sensing that they were close to their goal, ordered the door to be broken down. However, as soon as the first blow of the axe rang out in the hall, the air around them began to thicken. The door began to slowly open, releasing black smoke. The warriors prepared for battle, but none of them were prepared for what they saw. A figure stepped out of the darkness before them, clad in armor as black as if woven from the darkness itself. It was Gul'dan, the legendary warlock whose soul had been cursed to wander between worlds forever. His eyes glowed green, and every step he took sent waves of fear through the warriors' hearts. Gul'dan raised his hand, and bolts of darkness erupted from his fingers, striking the nearby orcs. Their bodies began to disintegrate before their comrades' eyes, and they fell to the ground in agony. Gul'dan reveled in their suffering, his laughter echoing through the hall as if mocking their helplessness. Gromash, realizing that their chances of survival were rapidly fading, gathered all his strength and charged. His axe flashed through the air, but each blow passed through Gul'dan's body as if he were a shadow. The warlock only smirked, mocking Gromash's desperate attempts. The warriors, overcome with terror, continued to fight, but their efforts were in vain. One by one they fell, and Gul'dan drew on their fear, growing ever stronger. Gromash knew this was the end, but he would not give up without a fight. When the last warrior fell, Gromash, bleeding, knelt before Gul'dan. He did not beg for mercy, did not ask for mercy. His eyes burned with hatred and determination. Gul'dan, seeing this, only chuckled and spoke words in an ancient tongue that Gromash did not understand. At that moment, time seemed to stand still. Gromash felt his soul leaving his body, his life slipping through his fingers. But at the last moment, he made one last effort. Grabbing his axe with both hands, he put all his rage, hatred, and pain into the blow, aiming it straight at the warlock's heart. The world exploded around them. Black smoke filled the chamber, obscuring everything from view. Gul'dan froze in place, his face contorted into a silent scream. But this time, it was not a scream of triumph, but one of pain and despair. His body began to dissolve into thin air as if he were just a part of the darkness. Gromash, exhausted and wounded, collapsed to the ground. When the smoke cleared, all was still. There was no trace of Gul'dan or his magic left in the chamber. Blackrock was silent once more, but this silence was different, filled with peace. The warriors who had fallen in battle were freed from their eternal damnation, but Gromash knew that his fate would be different. He remained at the fortress, guarding it as many had done before him. His body was gone, but his soul remained, bound to this place, forever cursed to watch over the Black Rock and those who dared approach it. Months, maybe years passed. No one knew what had happened at Black Rock, but rumors continued to spread. The Horde no longer sent their people there, knowing that the place was forever cursed. Legends of Gromash Timbercutter and his company became part of the terrible tales that warriors told each other before battle. But no one knew that behind these tales lurked the true horror, forever locked within the walls of Black Rock. Every night when the moon rises, the shadows come alive again in the Black Rock. They whisper in a language they do not know.
Blight of the Bloody Age. A silent night shrouded the valley like a blanket woven of mist and starlight. In the distance, beyond the rocky ridges, Lancair lurked, once the majestic capital of a great empire, now reduced to ruins, the stuff of terrible tales. It was said that these lands were cursed. No one ever returned if they ventured deep into Lancair, and even the most desperate travelers avoided it. But it was not always so. Centuries ago, at the height of its glory, the Lancair Empire controlled half of the known lands. Its armies were invincible, and its mages were among the most powerful in the world. However, everything changed when the Bloody Age began. The Bloody Age was a time when the very concept of humanity lost its meaning. Wars were fought not for honor, wealth, or power, but for survival. Lancair, like many other kingdoms, fell to the onslaught of madness that engulfed the world. But what seemed like another round of war turned out to be a harbinger of a terrible disaster. Somewhere deep in the mountains that surrounded Lancair, an ancient evil was found, bound in age-old chains. The Blight, as the sages called it, an ancient entity born from the darkness itself, was awakened by bloodshed. At first, its influence was felt as little more than a breeze, a whisper in the night. But with every gallon of blood spilled, its power grew. The darkness emanating from the Blight began to seep into the souls of men, twisting their minds, turning them into puppets of a ruthless force. The mages who once protected Lancair tried to resist the scourge but failed. The more they used their magic, the stronger the scourge grew. Soon it became so powerful that it consumed the mages themselves, turning them into hideous monsters that roamed the ruined streets, never knowing sleep or rest. The people said that the Blight was not just a destructive force. It was a hungry entity, thirsting for suffering and pain. The more it consumed, the stronger it became, spreading its influence to neighboring lands. Villages were abandoned, cities disappeared, and people lost their minds, succumbing to the madness that the Blight brought. But no P-40. The road grew darker with each passing day, and the darkness that emanated from Lancair grew thicker over the land. The 6 travelers, each carrying a secret and a pain, made their way through the dead lands where villages and fortresses once stood. The sky here was constantly covered with thick clouds, so that even during the day, the light barely penetrated the shroud. They walked, although each step became more difficult, as if the land itself resisted their presence. At the head of the group was Ulrich, a warrior with scars on his face and soul. He was a veteran of many battles, but even he felt fear creeping into his heart. Behind him was Iris, a young healer with the gift of foresight, her eyes filled with anxiety for the future. At her side was Darian, a mage whose power had been half spent fighting the beasts of the fell. He walked with his hand on the hilt of his staff, ready to call upon the last of his magic at any moment. Behind them walked the twins, Fenric and Liara, hunters, masters of the bow and blade. They were silent and wary, their footsteps silent. Last of all was an old scholar named Merivald, keeper of ancient knowledge, the only one who could decipher the forgotten texts and maps that could lead them to their goal. The travelers barely spoke to each other, for everyone knew that any mistake could cost them their lives. Sometimes Iris broke the silence, whispering warnings about what she saw in her visions, ominous shadows that stalked their trail, voices calling from the void, images of the dead who tried to block their path. They reached an ancient stone bridge that spanned a dry river. The bridge was eroded by time, and the Blight, its stones covered in strange black growths that moved as if alive. As they approached, Merivald stopped and raised his hand, calling for silence. "This bridge is more than just a river crossing. It is an ancient boundary," he said quietly. "Once, this was the border of Lancair, guarded by sentinels. Now it is the threshold between our world and the territory where the Blight is strongest." Ulrich looked at the growths on the rocks and frowned. "What kind of abomination is this? I've never seen anything like it." Merivald carefully touched one of the black masses, and it immediately recoiled as if alive, making a creaking sound. "These are traces of the Blight. They penetrate stone, metal, flesh, anything they can reach. We must be careful." "Aif." Well, for a moment there was an eerie silence, as if the world held its breath. Then figures emerged from the darkness, tall, gaunt creatures, hunched and shrouded in ragged shadows. Their faces were hidden, but an eerie glow emanated from them. These were not living beings, but the ghosts of the dead, those who had fallen to the Blight. "These are the Guardians. They no longer obey the living," Merivald whispered, studying the approaching figures. "We must move on, or we will be consumed by the darkness as they were." But the spirits, driven by the power of the filth, did not allow them to leave. The ghosts began to approach slowly, stretching out their arms, their movements unnatural, as if they were being pulled by an invisible force. Each step was given to them with effort, but they did not stop. Ulrich, feeling his heart tighten, stepped forward, standing between the ghosts and the others. "Do not think of them as living. They have been dead for a long time. They are merely shells filled with darkness," he said, raising his sword. "We will pass through them." The twins nodded and fired their arrows, which passed through the ghosts without harming them. The arrows, meeting emptiness, hissed into the air. "It's useless," Darian said grimly, feeling his magic respond to the darkness presence. "But they're not invulnerable. They can be resisted." Iris, clutching the amulet in her hands, stretched her hand forward, and a quiet light began to emanate from her palm. The light was weak, but it made the ghosts freeze. Their figures began to tremble and flicker like a flame in the wind. Light. Light is their weakness, she said, her voice strained. But it is not enough. We must find a way to get through them without losing ourselves. Merriwald stepped forward slowly, his eyes narrowed, and began to quietly speak ancient words that had been forgotten over time. With each word, the light emanating from Iris grew brighter, piercing the darkness, and the phantoms began to retreat, their forms becoming less and less tangible. "We need to go now," Alric shouted, feeling their chance for salvation slip away. They ran forward, crossing the bridge, leaving behind the ghosts that slowly dissolved into the fog. But even when they reached the other side, the darkness did not leave them. It followed them, whispering threats in a language none of them understood. But ahead, among the hills and ruined buildings, Lancair began. Their path lay where the darkness was deepest, and where they hoped the secret was hidden that could end the scourge once and for all. And now, standing on the edge of this abyss, they knew that trials lay ahead of them, far more terrible than anything they had faced before. But there was no turning back.
The broken kingdom of Lancair. The ruined streets of Lancair were dark, the darkness deepening with every step. The city, once magnificent, was now consumed by the Blight, an ancient evil that permeated every crack and crevice of the stone. The rubble of buildings lay everywhere, overgrown with black mold and warped by time. The travelers, 6 of them, walked through the darkness, their shadows moving as one, across the ruined streets and endless ruins. Alric, a warrior whose body was cut with scars, led them forward, his powerful body, despite his fatigue, still moving with confidence and determination. In his hand was a sword, which, although dimly glowing in the shadows, was still ready for battle. His armor creaked under every step, and every sound in the darkness seemed like thunder reverberating off the walls. Iris, the healer, walked beside them. Her light amulet flickered like a weak candle flame, trying to dispel the darkness, but it was not enough. She could feel the darkness of the fell creeping into her mind, making it feel like the fell itself was trying to reach out to her. Her face was pale, her eyes filled with fear and foreboding. Darian, the mage, trudged along behind her. His cracked staff gave off a dim light, but every attempt to use magic seemed painful. His face was tired and sore, and each spell was harder for him, as if the magic was draining his strength. Fenric and Liara, the twin masters of the bow, moved silently, wary, and focused. Their bows were drawn, arrows at the ready, every sound in the silence causing them to react instantly. They were alert, their eyes scanning every shadow, ready to strike. Merivald, the scholar, brought up the rear, carrying ancient manuscripts. These books, full of knowledge and secrets, were his only hope of successfully completing their mission. He read the texts, deciphering them and trying to find a way to stop the scourge. His hands shook with the effort, and his eyes scanned the pages in concentration. Their path led to an ancient archive, hidden underground, which contained the knowledge needed to complete the ritual. Dust and mold covered the ancient books and scrolls, and each time they were opened, the air was filled with a rustling sound, like the whispers of a forgotten time. Liara and Fenric walked around the archive, checking every corner for traps and monsters lurking in the shadows. Alric and Iris headed to a ruined temple where one of the artifacts was located. The temple was full of traps, sinister mechanisms, and monsters created by the scourge to protect its treasures. Each step was careful and measured, each movement thought out. The darkness in the temple thickened, forming streams of black energy that tried to penetrate their consciousness. Darian and Fenric explored the old mines where they encountered terrible creatures born of the Blight. The mines were full of debris and cracks that emitted an ominous light. Each collision was intense. Each blow was brutal and bloody. In the silence of the mines, only the sounds of battle, dull thuds and screams of creatures trying to protect their lair were heard. When the travelers had collected all 3 artifacts, they returned to the dungeon to complete the ritual. The Blight was at its full strength, its darkness and destruction at its peak. The darkness surrounded them like a living creature, trying to absorb every ray of light. The travelers used all their strength and abilities. Every step was at the limit of their capabilities. The ritual they were performing was complex and dangerous. Each spell required concentration. Each gesture was calculated to the smallest detail. The Blight tried to disrupt the ritual. Its darkness contracted and swirled, creating vortices of energy that tried to stop them. There was a struggle in every moment, a desperate resistance in every spell. When the final touch of the ritual was completed, the Blight began to retreat. The darkness it brought to Lancair began to dissipate, and the first ray of light broke through the gloom. The city, although destroyed, began to slowly return to life, and the darkness that engulfed it weakened. The travelers, exhausted and worn out, left Lancair, knowing that their feat had given the world a chance to recover. Their names remained in legends as a symbol of courage and fortitude, of those who were able to defeat the darkness and bring light back to the ruined world. Tell this even longer at such a pace.